that actually it's just an emotion you have to feel.
I'm going to have to feel it.
Every other emotion.
I'm going to have to, I know.
Yeah. So let's have a chat with some of our spirit friends who are going through those particular things and see what they've got to say about their experiences. And I think we were going to start with
Sonya.
Sonya's experience, weren't we? Or one or two of Sonya's experiences that she could maybe highlight, which might show the case in point.
Yeah, so I just need a little minute.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is Sonya again.
Yeah.
This is a little trickier for me than for the other people.
You can't remember, can you?
No.
and maybe this is something I need to raise just for our audience's very point. Once you've processed an emotion, you can remember the event, but you can't feel the emotion anymore. It's like the memory of the emotion is gone.
So I find it difficult to discuss these things in as much detail as I know my brothers and sister here are going to be able to, because I'm having to cast my mind back to a time that feels very long ago. And also I'm trying to almost inhabit myself in a way that I was before so that I can accurately express what it was
what it felt like
to and what my false beliefs really were.
Yeah.
Because as you correctly state, once they're gone, they seem so false as to not warrant any attention anymore. And it's almost as if I think, why was I like that?
Exactly. And in the future, we'll be having, as you know, we're planning some discussions about repentance and forgiveness. And obviously, that's going to be quite an emotional discussion, and people will start to see the reason why you can't emotionally remember, because that's how you actually go through things. But perhaps one thing that might help is to have the person who helped you,
okay,
who would actually remember your experiences probably better than you would have at the time.
Yeah.
And maybe they could relate some of these experiences that you actually went through.
Okay. So my friend Amantu, yes, who is a male, a friend of mine, helped me at this time.
Yep.
So he's come to help me reflect again on these issues. So as I mentioned, I had grown up in this sort of a religious environment, and I didn't foster much.
Can we be more specific?
In a Christian, so it was an Anglican faith.
Yep. And where did you live?
I lived in England.
Yep.
And yes, so I didn't foster much anger in my life on earth. I wasn't drawn to angry states very much, but I had inherited from my mother some ideas about service and self-denial. And some of these were the hardest, some of my injured viewpoints of these things were some of the hardest things for me to give up after I passed into the spirit world. I didn't give them up on earth, and I never challenged them on earth. And I was involved in actually doing some good deeds for people when I was on earth, for which there were some rewards when I passed. But I had to come to face that not all of my motivations were 100% pure. So
here we're talking specifically about motivations for self-sacrifice, doing things for others because it's the right thing to do. And these are areas that you believed were right as well, weren't they? These were like you firmly believed that this was right. This is the proper thing to do.
And I firmly believed it was selfish for me to explore avenues of my personal creativity and my personal
joy, happiness,
things that I enjoyed doing just for leisure, pleasure.
Just for your own pleasure.
For my own self.
There always had to be some alternative, other than for yourself, some alternate benefit.
And I firmly believed that the way that I personally, as a person, received joy was through the service of others, to others.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which is one method way we can receive some joy, obviously, but
Yes.
Not all.
Not all. And I did receive some genuine joy.
Yes.
But I was very, very resistive to the idea when I was faced with my brother here and friend, when he was attempting to help me while I was still in the lower spheres, to engage in parts of my personality that were unique and that were about being creative and having fun and being lighthearted and joyful and just experiencing my own sort of sensory, emotional pleasure in doing things.
So Amantu would then, he would remember probably those events and how you first responded better than you do, probably.
Yes, so, okay.
So perhaps if we just get him to explain, like, what was the response to being told, for example, that, you know, all the things you were doing weren't necessarily for the right reason.
Okay, so I'll hand over to him.
Sure.
Hello, my brother.
Hello.
Thank you for this invitation.
It's my pleasure.
I remember my sister Sonya well, and she was very cranky.
When you say cranky.
She was very upset about the idea of, and she felt no motivation, almost like, as you would say on earth, like she didn't want to get out of bed.
So she was passive-aggressive angry.
Passive-aggressive of, what's the point? I don't even care about that stuff. Why are you talking to me about it? And very much pushing me away whenever I tried to talk to her about being her unique self and looking after herself and her desires.
And what drew you into the conversation initially with her about it?
Well, I could see that this was something that was holding her back, and it was part of my assignment to help her progress. And so she would just be idle much of the day because she had run out of people to look after. Her condition was such that she was not surrounded by people suffering.
So this was like, she was now in what sphere?
In the third sphere.
So yeah, there's not too many people suffering too badly in the third sphere.
And life is very pleasant.
Of course.
But she was very resistive to engaging with the pleasure of her surroundings, the beautiful waterfalls, the lovely nature, the artwork that is actually a part of her soul, painting and creating visual things is a part of Sonia's unique personality that she enjoys.
So was it true at the time she was drawn back to the hills to a degree to help people down there? Or?
Yes, but over time she became sort of listless about how to occupy herself.
Yes.
She was always attempting to go back there, but there was some feeling of it wasn't bringing her satisfaction. She felt at times annoyed that people wouldn't take her help. Initially, and then she sort of worked through this understanding that unless they desired help, it was pointless giving help. But then she just felt at a loose end. And so some of the things that she had to work through was, as you said, the passive aggression, allowing that to become a painful anger. So she instead
of storing up this passiveness by going, I'm just not going to do much, and I'm just going to relax and whatever.
I'm not taking part. I don't really care. Was some of the way she used.
That's how it started.
So I would engage with her in discussions about this, and we would find ourselves in situations where there was things that would spark her natural creativity and interest, but she had some. Essentially, it was fear about engaging those things and feeling that she was being selfish or naughty by doing them. And so what the process Sonya had to go through was a sense of painful anger, of feeling like rather than just disengaging with what was challenging her, allowing me to challenge her and the activities to challenge her so that she could begin to feel her resistance as a feeling of painful, no, I don't want to, which quickly dissolved into a sense of fear, which was exposing the false belief that she was being selfish by doing these things.
And then when she went through the fear, what kind of body sort of responses were there in that process?
Well, going through the fear was quite a contracting sort of a feeling of restriction and a kind of painful sort of a contraction.
Yeah.
But then a most beautiful physical change came upon Sonya, where it was like her entire being relaxed and became softer.
Yeah. Now, was there a lot of tears in that process, or?
Yes.
Yes.
Especially in the initial painful anger.
Yeah.
Was quite a tearful and sort of a tearful process, as Sonya first had to face the fear of acknowledging that she was in fact angry.
Yeah.
Because she judged that very strongly.
And she felt God would.
She felt that was making her bad.
Mm-hmm.
And so she had some cries about even just that was a part of releasing the resistance to the knowledge, the kind of emotional knowledge that, yes, she was angry.
Mm-hmm.
And then she let some of the anger of, it was very childlike, this anger she had to go through of like, no, I don't want to, no, I'm not going to. And that eventually, that exposed the fear that she had, which was, I'm never going to be loved and accepted while I have this anger, this fear, or desire.
This desire, yeah.
Yes. And
in other words, she wasn't allowed to have a pure desire to enjoy something. She wasn't going to be loved and accepted if
she was afraid that was the truth.
Yeah.
And then as I continued to come around her, as she was willing to feel that fear, and she went through this very constrictive, almost like facing her worst possible
sort of nightmare that
she was going to go through this process of becoming honest with herself and realizing that she did actually enjoy this creative arts. And while this sounds very trivial,
it's not trivial at all. No.
It's not trivial whatsoever. This was a very important part of her growth.
Yeah.
This fear of like, oh no, I'm going to enjoy something for myself, that was quite a constricting and quite a terrible sort of overwrought time for Sonya, which would
terrifying for her is probably the best way of saying it.
Terrifying, which would be interspersed with times of some relief, because she had allowed some of that fear to sort of overwhelm her.
And when that fear overwhelmed her, she was crying then, was she?
She was crying, yeah. She was shaking and constricting. Yeah. And then eventually, the more we worked through that fear, or she worked through the fear, and I would help her to sort of remind her of
that was still there.
It was still there in front of her, this problem. Yeah. Eventually, this dissolved into quite a relieving, sobbing grief for a period of time, where she came to experience the grief that she had been taught from a very, very young age, that she was selfish if she enjoyed herself for herself. And once that was gone, Sonya was able to express her real self in a much more relaxed way, and she had a lot more pleasure and enjoyment in her life.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. Now, can we get some kind of estimate in terms of her time? I know that's quite difficult, because it's there's a lot obviously going on, and there's not, by the time you reach the third sphere, there's not much sleeping going on. So,
yes, if we were to estimate it in a way that someone on Earth could relate to, this whole process took between 2 to 3 years.
So how long was the process of just feeling like sort of numbed out to it?
Yes, so this was the longest period. So if we estimate maybe nearly 18 months probably is it
half
correct?
That time.
Yes.
Yep.
And then the awakening to the anger, if you like, the more
angry state, agitated,
dealing with
state.
the fear of acknowledging the anger and experiencing the resistance emotionally. This was sort of like a 3 to 4 month process.
Yes.
The fear process was almost the rest of the time, because Sonya had resistance. She would come in and out and in and out of
so
that.
touching it, walking away, touching it, walking away.
And once she then decided fully to surrender to the fear, this passed quite quickly, and then there was a couple of months, equivalent to Earth time, of really just releasing the grief, coming to feel the truth of that what she'd been taught as a child was an error and had harmed her, and feeling God's truth enter her on the issue. So that was a very healing time, really, of 2 to 3 months equivalent, and she was done.
So it's right to say, isn't it, that the resistive period is sometimes the most difficult period, and here we're just discussing 1 or 2 quite raw emotions, even though they're quite intense emotions on the planet, and they are quite intense emotions on the planet. There are a lot of religious people on the planet who are going to have to go through these emotions.
Yes.
And a lot of other people too.
And a lot of people who, what I noticed, I wasn't religious. I came from Africa. But I was taught in a sort of a tribal setting, really, that myself as an individual was not important. And my duty was to the group, to the society, to not just my parents, but my elders, and I had to fulfill a sort of a role. And I did that quite exuberantly on Earth, and I did well at that. But when I passed, I had to come to deal with a lot of the false beliefs that I had about what made me a good person, similar to Sonya, even though we had quite a different background.
Yes, and this is one of the reasons why you would have been assigned to her in the first place, to help her.
Yes.
So you've also been through a very similar experience, obviously.
Yes.
Yeah, all right. So perhaps thanks for saying about that. So Sonya, if we have Sonya back, Sonya remembers that now.
Yes, I have to thank my friend.
Because there's a lot of that you didn't sort of regret.
I had completely forgotten.
Yes.
I had completely forgotten, and almost this, almost all of it, really from an experiential, to describe it to you. I understand that I had the injuries, and I think during our previous conversation I sort of
mentioned them,
trying to remember them. I could tell you clinically that I had problems with these areas, but that is quite a beautiful process. That I went through, and it was quite nice to be reminded. In fact,
and that's why it's great to have an observer sometimes, isn't it? because quite often I wonder all the processes I've been through, how many people have been observing them. So sometime later it can be
many. Don't you worry. I've been privileged to witness them.
But it's an interesting process in itself, isn't it? That if we go back to the point that now you don't remember it from an emotional experience, in a way this should also be quite faith strengthening to people who are listening, because it should show them that once you go through the experience, no matter how traumatic it feels at the time, and when you come out of it sincerely, it's like it almost never happened, and you can barely even recall.
And certainly the fear and the pain and the anger, I feel so full of God's truth and God's loving opinion on those matters now, that it literally feels like there's no space in me for the false ideas that I laboured under for all of my earth life to even exist.
Yeah. And in some ways that should give people a lot of confidence too, that this emotional process that God's designed is actually the solution. You see people on earth spending many tens or decades of their life working through post-traumatic stress issues, when the reality is that most of the time we're not actually working through them and we're resisting them. And that's what causes a fair majority of our pain.
Yes, and this 2 to 3 year period, while it was in some ways intense, now that I remember more about it, in other ways, because it was because my growth and progress was foremost in my mind and my intention, even though I had resistance and different things that I was working through, I was able to progress on that one issue in 2 to 3 years. And to me, there was an improvement in my life.
Major improvement.
Not only at the end of the 3 years, but in the process of going through it. Yeah. And so it's a good investment of time.
Yeah, well, there's no other better investment of time, really, is there? That's what I find myself, but it's no other.
Especially when I consider the level to which I expressed my nature and personality at the start of that period and the amount to which I did even at the end of that period, and I was still really only in the higher realms of the third sphere at that time.
Yeah. So that's a great example of the experience. And it's also good that you couldn't remember a lot of it initially, so that we could illustrate to our audience how, once things pass, and you really no longer see them as important as you used to see them before at all. And in fact, you get to the point where it is true forgetfulness, where you really, you have to spend a lot of power to even go back there, even to remember the events, which is a process really of forgiveness, isn't it? That we engage through the process with God.
It's wonderful.
Yeah,
I'm looking forward to your discussion. I know you have discussion planned about forgiveness.
Yes,
soon.
Yeah. So we can illustrate many of those benefits too in that discussion. So that's one primary area, of course, that you had to address. Obviously, there would have been others. Most people have more than one, obviously.
Yes, there were, but this was, in fact, quite a major issue for me, which is why it was the first one that came to mind when you mentioned it in our previous discussion.
But interestingly enough, you'd reached the third sphere by this stage, before you started to deal with these particular emotions. And so, obviously other things had been dealt with before then quite a lot more easily. And this also is an illustration of how some of the most difficult emotions we face are often faced well into our progression, actually.
Yes.
And unless we've learnt this natural way of dealing with things emotionally by that stage, we wouldn't get through those particular emotions. And so you obviously had learnt up until that point that progressing emotionally is the way to go, and you decided that.
And I was open to my guide. Even though I had resistance, I had opened up to understanding that his guidance was there to help me, and that by listening, I had enough faith already.
Yes. And you hadn't succumbed to, is it the word indolence? Is that
indolence?
The word where, you become satisfied with getting to the second sphere, and
yes.
You obviously have felt that you could continue to progress, which is also an important part of progression. Yes,
and I suppose that while I was on earth, I did have some positive feelings about God and some truth. I did understand some truth about God. I didn't understand that a lot of what I felt about God was an error, and only part of it was truth. I felt all of it was truth. And some of what I dealt with in the lower spheres was about the truth about God, actually. But because I was willing to do that in the lower spheres, because that had been something that was important to me in my life on earth. So when I passed, I was open to hearing more about that from others. Because I had that desire for God that was being purified through my growing knowledge of the truth about God emotionally, through my progression, then that pulled me to keep going further.
Yeah, which is an important factor too, isn't it, in that process? Yeah. Now, that's very good. Thank you for helping us with that.
And thank you for helping me.
Well, I don't know if it helps you to remember things that you've forgotten, but anyway, I'm sure it was going to help many of the people who are listening to it.
Yes, and I do have a pure desire to help others now. So, but it helped me. Well, I should help my old friend as well.
Yes, and it's interesting, isn't it, too, how a person who's in a better condition than ourselves helping us through an experience can often relate the experience with more accuracy than we ourselves can relate it, which in itself is an interesting thing, because it tells us that often our concept of what is real and what is not real is often severely distorted as we're going through things. And this is where I feel I place, if the more trust you place in God and the process, the less you worry about how mixed up you are in the middle of it.
Yes, that is very true.
Yeah.
Yes, and I have been a helper and witness to other people's progress, and so I understand it's easier to recall as well.
Yeah.
But you're very correct. Often the error feels so much like truth while we're in this
and we're
state.
mixed up in a whole lot of false beliefs while we're going through it too, aren't we? But so much so that if we don't trust the process and we get so mixed up in the false beliefs of the actual emotion, we could actually just decide to stop the whole process there and then. So you've got to have some trust in the process.
Yes.
Before you'll go through the process, obviously, is what I'm probably getting at.
Yeah. Okay.
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 Okay.